Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming to this very interesting and informative Zoom session, and I know it is because I've seen the slides. I'm Patricia Spindell, Chair of Seniors for Social Action Ontario, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin, please ensure that you're muted so no sound interferes with our presenter. And please feel free to put any questions that you may have during the presentation in the chat. And then afterwards, we'll get you to put your hands up if anybody has any other questions. And Angela has kindly agreed to take people's questions. So I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Angela Roberts. She's the Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Data Analytics and Digital Health in Cognitive Aging and Dementia, and she holds a joint appointment in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders and the Department of Computer Science at Western University. She's also a speech language pathologist and is the founding co-director of the university's collaborative specialization in machine learning in health and biomedical sciences and a research associate with the Canadian Centre of Activity and Aging. Her research on superagers has shown that attitude may be as important as anything else in helping older people to thrive. So please welcome Dr. Angela Roberts.
Thank you very much for hosting me today. Before I share my slides and block myself out, I just want to thank Trish and Harry for the invitation, and really to all of you to have the opportunity to share the work that we're doing. And so I'll share my slides here. Really look forward to the questions afterward. For me, that's the space that I learn the most in. And so I always consider these an opportunity to pass out information, but also to take in information. And each one of these talks is always really important as we think about where are we going next in the research space. So I'm going to pull up my slides and hopefully everything works as intended. There we go. And Patricia, if you'll just confirm for me that everything looks good to go on your side. Okay,
Yep.
thanks, Harry. I appreciate that. Um, So I'm going to talk a little bit today about our Super Ager research program, but I'm also going to kind of tie this into dementia and some of the more current research on dementia prevention, because really we're starting to see the work that we've been doing in what we think about as exceptional cognitive aging as we get older. So people who have preserved cognitive abilities such as thinking and memory skills, and also preserved brain function late into life. And we're starting to see this now converge with some recent clinical trials that show that even after we've developed perhaps changes in cognition, early dementia, or mild cognitive impairment, that there are still ways to slow down and perhaps even in some people significantly slow down those changes. And so I say that because really this super aging research program, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, was built as a way of trying to better understand dementia and conditions such as Parkinson's disease. So one of the pieces that we had known about for some time, and this is the one of the dirty secrets of dementia research, is that oftentimes when we're doing research, we are comparing people with dementia or with Parkinson's disease to people who do not have dementia or who do not have Parkinson's disease, and we call those our control group. But one of the challenges in aging research, and one of the challenges in dementia research in particular, and I've spent my life kind of researching brain disorders that happen to us as we get older and cause progressive decline, what we think about as being neurodegenerative conditions. One of the challenges that we find is that our control groups often go on within 5 or 6 years to develop the same condition that they're supposed to be the control for. And so in essence, that means that oftentimes when we're doing dementia studies, we're actually comparing people with dementia to sometimes people who have pre-dementia or the earliest stages of dementia but are not yet symptomatic. So the super aging research program really grew out of a need, which was to have a better set of controls for understanding what are predictors of dementia and what might be interventions that we can put into place. to help slow down or to minimize the risk of developing dementia. And it really happened to us kind of in this accidental way, where in the context of doing dementia studies, we came across older adults. Sometimes they were family members of people who had dementia, who were not just aging typically, but were aging exceptionally. Meaning that their brain didn't age beyond the 50 or 60 fifth or sixth decade, and their cognitive performance stayed very similar to those in their 50s and 60s. And that made us kind of look up and go, whoa, what are these people? Who are them? Who are these individuals, and what makes them different? And so the research program that I'm going to talk to you about today is really kind of centered in this space where we're thinking about not just aging well and not just longevity, but also dementia prevention. So I do not have to kind of perhaps tell this group that we are living, although I often have to tell people who are 40 and younger, that we are living in a society and an aging Canada. And what that means is that our expectation of people 65 and older is going to double. And we know that one of the fastest growing population groups in Canada today are those who are 80 and older. So it's not even, if we kind of look at the microcosm of people over 65, the fastest growing age group are people who are 80 and older in this country. And we're even seeing and expecting, our number of centenarians to double in this country in the next 10 to 20 years. And we have a rapidly growing number of centenarians, or people who are 100 and older in this country. So we are aging, and we are aging quickly. And this contrast with population data that we've had really for about the last 15 years. And getting closer to 20 years now, that show that at the same time that the number of people 65 and older, now 80 and older, are increasing, the number of people 15 and younger is decreasing. And we see those two curves just almost in a complete opposite of one another, where the same almost rate of decline in 15 and younger is the same rate of decline in those 65 and older. And this is a trend that we are seeing around the world. So it is not just a Canadian trend. In fact, the only place in the world where we do not see this is on the African continent, where we tend to see, not so much of this kind of large exponential growth in aging adults. Within Canada, we see this trend across all provinces, although certainly the most rapidly growing aging populations are in British Columbia, Ontario, and in Quebec. Although we see this phenomenon across the country. So the question for our research, and whether we're talking about our superagers or we're in the realm of thinking about dementia, the real kind of topic for our research is not the question of how long we're going to live, but how do we ensure that we understand the science of how to help people live well while they are aging. So I'm going to share with you throughout my talk today, you're going to see pictures of what I think are beautiful individuals on almost every slide. These are all individuals who are in our super aging research program. So they are not stock images, they are real people. And so on this slide, I'm going to introduce you to Miss Edith Renfro Smith. Miss Edith died earlier this year at the age of 111 years. And so at that age, she was having to use a walker because her joints had just kind of given out a little bit. She was living in a retirement facility for really just the last couple of years of her life. But she was fiercely independent and still had all the hallmark traits of a superager. She was cognitively still largely in performing very well, and decades younger than what her age would say. And she also had all the kind of characteristic traits of a superager. She lived this life of tremendous resilience. In fact, she was the first Black woman to receive a teaching license and teaching certificate in the state of Illinois. And if you go to Grinnell College today outside of Chicago, there are many buildings named for her. And you can actually find lots of good interviews with Miss Edith that she's given over the years. If you just look her up, she's easy to find and kind of see her life story. But Miss Edith was one of those people who taught us the lesson of the fact that getting older did not necessarily mean that people had to experience the same degree of cognitive decline or the same experience of shrinking of the brain or the kind of what we think about as being age-related changes. In fact, Miss Edith and many like her have shown us that even what we think about as being age-related changes needs to be rewritten a bit. So when we think about this kind of line of research, it's what we have learned is that the brain kind of continues to adapt. It continues to integrate experience. It continues to find new meaning, and that can actually help to preserve some of what we think about as age-related decline. So I'm going to challenge us all today as I go through my slides here, and I'm good at digressing, so I'm going to try to keep myself on track. What I'm going to challenge us all to think about, and as we get to the question period today, I want to hear more about your thoughts. What if aging well were something we could actively shape? What if it wasn't a passive process? And I actually had an active discussion with someone yesterday. I was giving a talk on this topic, and he approached me at the end and he said, but isn't aging a disease? So I'm going to let you try to imagine what my answer to that is. And we can kind of address this in the question period. But I'm going to ask all of us to reflect on these two questions. What if aging well is something we can actively shape? And is aging a disease? Because I think how we view aging as either a natural process that we can shape or whether we view it as a disease actually changes how we see ourselves as we age. And it's a really important question for us to tackle. So I'm going to ask you to kind of hold those thoughts in mind and see if you can guess my perspective on this. The wonderful woman sitting in front of you, her name is Anne. Anne is on her lifetime trip or her trip of a lifetime starting here in a couple of weeks. At her kind of mid 80s, she's taking a trip to Japan. That was something she always wanted to do. She's doing it largely independently. And this was a gift from her children. So I saw her a few weeks ago and she filled me in on this adventure that she's on. And so Anne is certainly one that helps us understand health span, not just longevity. And I want to make it clear that the research that we do is not about helping people live to be 220. That's not what we're into. The other thing that probably contrasts the work that we do is in no way does the research that I engage in, is it intended to help fuel what we are now seeing as the longevity economy. And we're seeing this all over the place where this idea of a longevity economy where there is significant money to be made for building out supplements and pharmaceutical interventions that people start taking in their 30s and 40s that are supposed to help them live for forever. And so our research is really thinking about cognitive health span and physical health span, and how do we kind of shrink this gap between how long we are living and the years that we are living in good health. And I think this is probably the most important question for us to be asking and hopefully answering. So I'm going to walk you through kind of what we've learned over the last several years from the research that we've been doing in superaging. And as I said, where it starts to kind of interface with the research that's been done in dementia. And I'm going to cover kind of 5 pillars, what we think about as being the 5 core pillars that we've learned from this research around aging well. The one thing that we've learned is that aging well, first of all, and even defining what we mean by aging well means something differently to everyone. And so when I work with Indigenous communities, this idea of what it means to age well has a different kind of context than it might be for someone who comes from more of a European background. What we know, though, consistently is it doesn't necessarily mean the absence of disease. What it does mean is preserving function and resilience. And in fact, when we think about our superagers, and in all of our studies, we have our superagers and then we have our control group. And here, everyone's over the age of 80. And the control group that we're looking at are people who are 80 and older, who have age typical or what we kind of think about as normal cognition for being 80. When we compare those two groups, one of the things that really comes out is that they don't necessarily, superagers don't necessarily have lower rates of heart disease, lower rates of arthritis, lower rates of macular degeneration. In fact, They absolutely have macular degeneration. They sometimes need a walker to get around. Um, and they have the other health issues that we think about as being kind of chronic comorbidities. So aging well does not necessarily mean an absence of disease. What it could mean, though, and what we do see is a resilience to some of those age-related changes. And what we definitely see is that what defines really kind of high cognitive resilience, and this is true across the world and across, again, as we think about even different communities within Canada, it is this context of being able to engage in your everyday meaningful activities in a way that is important to you. That is how most groups will define what it means to age well. So who are super agers? On this slide, I'll introduce you to Roy. Roy just turned 100 in the last 3 months or so. We just had a big birthday party for him. And I always say this fact, I don't show the video sometimes because if I show the video, it gets snagged in a Zoom presentation. But Roy could literally kind of walk a block probably faster than most 50 or 60-year-olds that I know. And so he truly has that kind of aspect of both physical and cognitive exceptionality. But to qualify as a superager, and so much of the research I'll be talking to you about are about these people who are 80 and older. Um, Sometimes I say that we're the only group that people will actually call us and say, "Oh, I'm 78. I can't get in yet. I can't wait till I turn 80." And I'm like, we're one of the few contexts where people will say, "I can't wait till I turn 80." And we do keep people on a birthday list, and we have people who have called us on their 80th birthday and say, "I'm enrolling today. I've been waiting for 2 or 3 years to get into this study." But superagers are people who are 80 and older. To qualify as a superager, their memory performance has to be equal to those in their 50s. And oftentimes we're seeing them kind of really coming in around 52 to 55 years of age if we're doing a comparative performance. The other thing that we see in superagers, and this is a consistent finding now across almost 15 years of research, is that when we look at the brains of individuals who kind of meet this cognitive criteria, their brain is also different. So this is not just, some people will say to me, is this just that they're good at test taking? That's not it. In fact, when we look at doing brain scans such as MRIs, and we look at a couple of things here that are important. We're looking at shrinkage of the brain because as we get older, the brain naturally shrinks a little bit. And we're also looking at the cortical surfaces. Those are the outside surfaces of your brain. And this kind of concept of what's called cortical thinning. And so the cortex or the outside edges of your brain are really important for conveying information across the different regions of your brain that are involved in thinking and movement and decision making. And so we need that thickness to be there to really help to optimize our cognitive functioning. But as we get older, the cortex thins ever so slightly, and we call that cortical thinning. But the one thing that we see in superagers is that this exceptional memory performance is matched by less cortical thinning, and less age-related shrinkage. And in fact, when we line up their brain scans, we're looking at things like atrophy and cortical thinning, they also look more equivalent to someone in their 50s and 60s. And so this isn't just a cognitive trick. It is matched by a slowing of what we have always thought about are the natural age-related processes in aging. They also tend to be more socially connected, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But it's this idea that our trajectory of how we age can be shaped, and I'll show you some genetics data that also kind of tells us part of that story. So one of the things that we see in superagers, and I just got a notification actually just before I came on that our paper in this area has been published. So it was like one of those things that you guys were all actually coming into the room, and I'm watching we got the email that this has been accepted. So you'll be seeing this out probably in the news here shortly. But it's this idea that at least in our superagers, one of the things that they're teaching us is that the traditional classic risks of what we thought were the genetic risk for dementia do not always hold true. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. ApoE is a gene that we know is linked to having a high risk of getting Alzheimer's disease, which can lead to Alzheimer's dementia. Um, and so if you have, you can have different combinations of alleles. You have two alleles on this gene, and you can have different combinations of those. For example, some people say that the E2 allele can be somewhat protective from getting Alzheimer's disease, but the E4 allele increases your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. And so, what we have conventionally believed and learned from science is that if you have two E4 alleles, you have a really high risk of getting Alzheimer's disease and a really high risk of getting Alzheimer's dementia as a result of carrying Alzheimer's disease. But the interesting thing is that in some of our superagers, we actually see that they can have, it depends on where this study has been done around the world. So people have looked at this in different regions around the world. But in general, superagers do not necessarily carry an overall lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. In fact, some of our superagers who are over 100 years of age, so they would be in this centenarian group, actually carry two E4 alleles, meaning they are in the highest risk group for developing Alzheimer's disease. And yet in life, because you can pretty much guarantee that, I'd say, why is this group really important? Because if you live to 100 with two E4 alleles and you've not developed Alzheimer's dementia yet, you are probably not going to develop Alzheimer's dementia. And in some of these individuals, we actually see evidence of the disease. We can see some evidence of Alzheimer's disease. We have a brain donation program that's a part of this research, so we can look at their brain tissue after they die. We can actually see evidence of Alzheimer's disease, but no evidence of the Alzheimer's dementia in life. And so this becomes important when we start thinking about, are there other protective factors? And indeed, part of what our research has done is highlighted maybe a couple of genes that might be somewhat protective here that can help us better understand risk and relative risk and interventions in Alzheimer's. But the other thing that it's really helped us to understand, and again, not just our work, but some of this work that's done globally, is that while the genetics are important, lifestyle plays a huge factor here in terms of how we expect some of these genes to express. But the super aging story is a really important one because it started to shift and change how we think about this kind of E4, ApoE E4 related risk around Alzheimer's dementia. And has become a kind of an important area of research as we think about both understanding causes of, but also treatments for dementia. So I'm going to talk a little bit now around how this starts to interface with what we're also learning from the dementia research. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the FINGERS trial, which you may have heard about. Here in Canada, we called it the CAN-THUMB trial. I've never understood why it was fingers, CAN-THUMB. I think there's another country where it's called like maybe the pointer trial. So you have the fingers, pointer, CAN-THUMB. Everyone picked a different digit when they brought this trial into their region of the world. A study started a little over a decade ago. But some really exciting findings came out of this last year, and these findings were actually announced in Toronto at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference. But this idea that we now have kind of good randomized control trial, that kind of highest form if we think about intervention evidence, for the fact that lifestyle interventions put into place even after someone has started to experience cognitive decline or the early stages of dementia can actually slow down cognitive decline. And so what we had evidence of this kind of coming out of the original CAN-THUMB trial here in Canada, as well as the FINGERS trial out of Europe. And in this most recent version, what they did was something that was even a little bit more precise. They took two groups of people, a group that was kind of supervised and participating in an accountable exercise program that was undergoing regular vascular monitoring. And by this, I don't mean kind of going to your local pharmacy and putting your arm in that machine and checking your blood pressure when you pick up your drugs. I mean, actually, having your blood pressure and your blood sugar levels checked routinely with the family physician transition, as well as following something called the MIND diet. And I'll walk you through what that is here in a couple of slides. But people who followed the MIND diet had an accountable exercise program and had routine and regular vascular monitoring, had as much as a 25% improvement in cognitive performance compared to a control group. And again, these were not people who were aging well at the time. These were people who had already developed some early signs of cognitive decline. So now we start to see this merging of research between what superagers do that we think might be linked to their strong cognitive resilience as they get older, and also seeing that lifestyle interventions can actually show some improvement. And we have seen this in kind of this more general cognitive decline group. And I should also indicate that in Parkinson's disease, conditions like Parkinson's disease, we now consider exercise and diet to be as powerful in early stages of the disease as the traditional medications used for Parkinson's disease. We get very similar effects just by exercise alone. And exercise has been linked to slowing cognitive decline in Parkinson's disease, as well as slowing the progression of the disease. So here in this space, and I'll talk a little bit about what we know from superagers, we really are starting to think about exercise and lifestyle interventions as medicine, and in some cases performing as well as or even outperforming kind of traditional pharmaceuticals in early stages of change. So I'll kind of latch into these 5 pillars here for a moment. And I just alluded to the first one, which is staying active. And the current Canadian guidelines here and are for moderate to vigorous physical activity of at least 150 minutes per week. And this is our evidence-based target. And I want to highlight this isn't just taking a walk around the block. This is actually getting your heart rate pumping. And so what we think about and what defines moderate to vigorous physical activity differs across everybody, because it's kind of what is your baseline, right? So whatever you need to do to get your heart moving and pumping is going to be different for you than somebody who's already running 10 kilometers a day, right? So those are our relative states. The point being that no matter where you find yourself in a health status, whether you are primarily in a wheelchair, whether you are up and mobile, there is an exercise that can get your heart pumping to get to this kind of moderate to vigorous level. And that is important for people to know. The other thing that I will say to you is we have found benefit of exercise regardless of the age that people have started. And certainly it is important that we start younger. The earlier we start in our 40s and 50s, the better, we think lifestyle interventions take hold in terms of long-term risk modification. However, I should note that we have superagers who did not start being significantly physically active at these levels until they were in their 70s, if not their 80s. And we still see the health benefits. In fact, we see people who start exercise in their 70s and are able to shift some of their cognitive outcomes even when they start exercise late in life. So there is never a point in time where it is too late to start. So I will always challenge when people say, oh, I can't move. I'm like, but you can get your heart rate up. And when they say, I'm too old to start, I say, never too old to start. And part of what we're seeing in our superagers shows us this. But I will say our superagers, and again, we have to remember that we think that after 80, we see this rapid decline in cognition. And so really when superagers are getting to their 90s and hundreds and still performing like 50-year-olds, that is really something pretty exceptional. One of the things that defines our superagers is they're getting at least 42 minutes a day of this moderate to vigorous physical activity. And so at the age of 85, 90, they are still out there really getting their hearts moving. And this includes people who are walking with walkers and sitting in wheelchairs. You might ask how we know this, and so I'll share with you a little bit around how we know this. I'll preface this by saying we actually have no prescribed guidelines in this country for health or healthcare provision for people over the age of 80. I want to make that really clear. So if I can give you guys a seniors action activity, and I will help support you in this, it is that we actually need, it is the fastest growing population in this country, and yet we have no prescribed health guidelines for people over the age of 80. In fact, the health guidelines that I point out to you in this first bullet point are developed for people who are 65 and 70. And it's almost as if we just did not expect people to live that long. And so we just didn't bother. And in fact, one of the things that bothers me most is when I'm out in the community, depending on where you are, women may be denied mammograms after the age of 80. Some people will be denied colonoscopies after the age of 80. Some physicians will pull people off medications just because we don't have evidence of how they can be used after the age of 80. And that's in part because clinical trials often cap enrollment at the age of 70. And so we literally have very little information around drugs work or screening practices for basic health in people over the age of 80 years. And so part of what we try to do with this research is amplify that voice and ensure that everything from organ transplants to basic medical screenings, to understanding how we prescribe medications, to even providing guidance on lifestyle, that we are starting to move toward having some of those guidelines. If I had a dollar, maybe these days not a dime, if I had a dollar for every time I give a talk and somebody says to me, my physician told me that I'm over the age of 80, I should just go home and sit and relax. I've earned it. And I'm like, no, you've earned the right to stay active and live in a community where you can be active, right? And so this is a big health crisis for us as a country right now, as we just literally are not set up for how to provide counseling and guidance to these folks. But super agers, certainly compared to our controls, have significantly higher amounts of moderate to vigorous physical activity. We know that because as part of this study, we actually send them home with wearable devices that we've custom built for people of this age, with understanding analytics that understand behaviors of older adults. Because if you're using just a regular commercially based activity tracker, they often do not accurately report activity levels or sleep levels for people who are older. And that's because the algorithms are largely normed on people who are 20 or younger. And so how we move as we get older is a little bit stiffer, a little bit slower. And so it tends to underestimate activity in aging adults. And so we've built kind of customized analytics for this. And so folks in our study actually wear these devices for weeks, sometimes months on end. And so we get a really good picture of what they're doing in their daily lives. We've learned that we have to do this instrumentally because, meaning no disrespect, if I ask people how much activity they do, they all overestimate. I'm not saying people lie. I'm saying they have a strong desire to please. And so in doing that, we often don't necessarily get the accurate data that we're looking for. So these data that I'm showing you actually come from our wearable devices program. The other thing that was really interesting about some of the work that we've been doing is we're getting some of the first pictures of women's health after the age of 80. So if you think there are few studies of people over the age of 80, there are even fewer studies of women's health over the age of 80. And so what we saw in these data is that superagers get more activity than controls. There's no doubt. But in both groups, women get more activity than men, and those differences are significant. And so people have always said women decline in activity as they get older. We're actually showing that in this eighth decade, women are getting more active and sometimes are more active than men. The second pillar that becomes really important here is protecting sleep. And none of us get enough sleep. I'm counted amongst those. But sleep is so vital. It is the way that our brain clears toxic waste. And that includes toxic waste like misfolded proteins such as amyloid beta or tau proteins. And these are important because amyloid beta and tau are often, the misfolding of those proteins are often the leading causes or pathology causes of dementia. And you have to remember there's like 30 plus different kinds of dementia, but amyloid beta and tau are often behind many of those forms of dementia, especially the most common ones. And so sleep is the way that we kind of clear out some of those damaged proteins. And poor sleep, in addition to kind of what we see in our superagers having better quality sleep, poor sleep is one of the strongest modifiable risk factors for dementia prevention. And so the better sleep you get, the better quality sleep you get, the lowers your risk for dementia and increases your risk for better cognitive aging outcomes. So I want to highlight kind of two things that are important here. It's not necessarily sleep duration. So we found no difference between the number of hours people sleep between these two groups. Now, the Canadian guidelines for aging say about 7 and 7.5 hours is good. And on average, both our controls and our superagers get about 7 hours of sleep a night. But there was no difference in the duration. What is different, though, is this figure that we call sleep efficiency. And sometimes, if you have an activity tracker, you'll see that as a marker on your smartwatch that you wear. But sleep efficiency is this measure of the amount of time you spend in bed compared to the amount of time that you spend in good quality sleep. And that's not necessarily the deepest of deep sleeps, but a quality enough sleep that helps to kind of clear out some of these proteins. And we can actually tell this from the wearable devices that we put on people, as can some of the commercially available devices. So a kind of minimal optimal sleep efficiency is 80%. And so here you're seeing our cognitively well aging controls are around 81%, but our super agers night to night have really good consistent sleep efficiency, upwards of 86 or 90%. On average, it's about 86%. And that 5% is enough to make a difference. And so sleep efficiency is one of those things that's controlled. And again, people will say, "Well, I have to get up and go to the bathroom at night. That disrupts my sleep." But even that is not that, that is a factor. And certainly you want to minimize how much you need to get up at night. But sleep efficiency is about sleep consolidation. It's what happens in those moments of sleep and how many interruptions you have by your own internal physical states during those consolidated moments of sleep. So again, superagers have more consistent, higher levels of sleep efficiency night to night. And the companion that goes with that is they have more consolidated or less fragmented sleep during the moments that they are sleeping. So, like others, they may have to get up and go to the bathroom 2 or 3 times a night. But when they are actually in sleep, it's a really very consolidated, low fragmentation sleep. And there's lots that we can do, and we can talk about this in the question period to help support better quality sleep. In fact, the most significant difference we find between superagers and controls is actually this sleep finding. So we know here that it's a real primary driver of this kind of cognitive outcome. I'll talk here for just a minute about the mind diet. And so I kind of nodded to this when I said in the fingers and can thumb and pointer trials that have been done around the world, this idea of the mind diet. And you can look up the mind diet. It's not a secret. In fact, it's easy to find online now. Consider this kind of people have talked about the Mediterranean diet for years, and the Mediterranean diet is important, but think about this as kind of an uber kind of refined approach to eating for brain health. And some studies have shown that the mind diet actually reduces the risk of Alzheimer's dementia by as much as 53% in people who adhere to it closely. So this again is this idea of food as medicine. And I will offer, as I'm sure some of you have heard, and I will concur with that, that the science does not support that getting this through supplements is the way to do it. It is actually getting it through the foods that matters. Leafy greens, berries, nuts, whole grains, olive oil, and fatty fish are neuroprotective, reducing your intake of red meat, things like butter that are highly dense in saturated fats, fast food, and refined carbohydrates. What the Mind Diet points out is that there's no single superfood. Despite what supplement manufacturers will tell you and try to get you to buy, it is really having this kind of robust and rounded diet across all these groups that is incredibly helpful. When we think about our super agers, and we have some diet record studies that have looked at kind of diet histories of super agers, I'm not sure that we see that they've necessarily stuck to what would have been called a mind diet. They do generally tend to be healthy eaters. Probably the most consistent finding that we see in our super agers is a very high fiber diet. And often they've been eating high fiber diets for decades. Um, People will sometimes say to me, gosh, is it just that superagers have been more fortunate in their lifetimes, that they are wealthier, that they've had higher quality diets? And I often have to remind folks that the superagers that we work with were children during World War II. They were, many of them, in bomb shelters growing up much of their life. They grew up in times of austerity, and so they have not always had the advantage of having healthy diets their entire lives. And in fact, they would argue that probably what made them superagers is a low childhood exposure to excesses because they didn't have candy and they didn't have treats, and they often didn't have those things that because they're, it was both wartime and post-war time, that meant that they probably didn't have access to foods that might be bad for us, as opposed to always having access to foods that were good for us. One of the other kind of key pillars to health here is this idea of staying socially connected. And it is a standout feature, not just in the Canadian super aging cohort, but in super aging studies around the world. And I will, here is where I will say to all of you, the fact that you show up and you're a part of a group like this is so incredibly important, because not only are you socializing and meeting other people, but you are collectively engaged in activities that keep you connected to one another and to the world around you. That is really this defining trait of social engagement that we see in superagers. It's not that they have 1,000 friends. In fact, I would argue that's not what we see, and nor do we see that in any study around the world. It's not the number of social connections that you have, but it is the depth and the fact that you're engaged in some co-creation of a meaningful activity that seems to really drive the benefits to aging that we see. Um, and so here is just some of the research that we've seen from around the world, including our own work, which is the number of and types of social contacts seem to be less important as opposed to the depth and meaning. So we often think about measuring this as the number of people you have versus the number of people you have in that innermost circle of people that you'd say, yeah, I could call upon this person if I really needed something. That circle and these folks that you're engaging in co-creation of kind of life and important activities is there. We see that in our superagers compared to controls that they have good lifelong mental health and can describe over their lifetime positive and supportive relationships. And studies from around the world are really starting to point to this fact that after the age of 70 to 75, depending on the study, that we actually see that superager, or we actually see that cognitive resilience may be more affected by social participation than even physical activity. So when we are younger, physical activity seems to be driving a lot of these health outcomes. And by younger here, I mean 50 and 60. But as we get older, the balance starts to change. Physical activity still stays very, very important, but the primary driver to cognitive outcome may be this social engagement and social participation. This is huge for reasons that I probably don't need to explain to this group, because of the incredible pandemic of social isolation that we've had of older adults that has even been an issue here in this country and was magnified during COVID, and we have never returned from that. And so here we have this perfect confluence of an aging population, a population that is more and more socially isolated than they have ever been, and a real need for us to consider as a country, how are we going to turn this tide? Because if we do not do so, then we're going to end up with higher and higher rates of dementia and other neurodegenerative conditions, because the basic ingredients for keeping people connected and keeping them active and designing our cities in such a way that do that, we've not prioritized. And so I make this a call to action for this group, because I know there's so many things that you all are involved in that kind of help to counter what I really worry about is a confluence of factors here that are going to be very problematic for us. And I say that because chronic loneliness and social isolation are linked to poor health outcomes. Chronic loneliness, if you start to experience that in your 50s and 60s, particularly we see this post-retirement, is associated with a 48% increased risk of developing dementia. These are older studies because they're kind of the foundational studies in this area that I've cited, but this has been a consistent finding in research for the last decade. Social isolation in midlife accelerates cognitive decline, and it does so through elevated cortisol levels, increased amyloid burden in the brain, reduced mitochondrial function, so you're not flushing out cellular waste as we should do to help keep a healthy mind and a healthy body. And so it's not just that social isolation can lead to mood differences or people not engaging in life. It actually is bad for the brain and bad for the body at a cellular level. And so this idea of social connectedness as a remedy to that is a really important one. In addition, when we think about having strong social communities and social bonds, and Trish, I got tickled as people were joining. You're like, oh, I get to see this person face to face, and this excitement in you as people were coming on and saying hello to one another. And I thought, gosh, it is true to this research, which is it's not just that social connectedness is important, but it serves as a catalyst for other areas of health. So when we are in strong social networks, it's easier to initiate and sustain physical activity. And people who exercise in a social group context often experience greater benefits than those who are exercising alone. And so while you can do your exercise routine at home, I really encourage you to think about social components, or at least having a buddy system in your exercise approach, because there does seem to be something that more and more we're seeking to understand the underlying reasons for, but there is something magical about kind of this pairing of exercise with social connection, particularly as we get older. And as I wrap up here, I'll highlight kind of two of some of my favorite folks who are in our study. This is Aileen and Harold, and they are on their way to the World Senior Olympics in August. Aileen is one who started training actively, being more physically active in her early 70s. Harold became her coach. He was having her do time trials up and down their driveway of their farm just outside of Stratford. And now she holds multiple world and Canadian records in track and field events. She was never a totally sedentary person, but she certainly would not have described herself as this avid athlete. And so her husband competes in some of the javelin activities and shot put activities, and she's a hurdler and a speed trials individual. And so they are off to Korea to compete in the World Masters Olympics here in August. They are an example of what it means to show up for life, right? Even in their seventh decade, they decided they needed to be doing something different. They were retiring. They had the family farm. She had retired as a teacher, but life needed to have more purpose. And it's this reminder to all of us that retirement is a transition, and there has to be this intentional repurposing. We know that the first 18 months after retirement leaves people really, really vulnerable because you've lost your social circles, you've lost some of that connection to the things that drove your meaningful kind of existence from day in and day out. And it's why oftentimes our group is now called into working with pension managers. I never thought my work would take me to meeting with pension managers from around the world, but it has. Or banks. When people call me and say, "Can you meet with us?" I'm like, "Oh, why?" But now, what kind of wealth management groups are finding and pension management groups are finding is that because people are living longer, they're taking on this responsibility of helping people transition into retirement in a healthy way. And also ensuring that people can transition to retirement earlier if they're able to do so. Financially, sometimes it makes sense. And for their health, their overall health and well-being, it can make sense. And yet people often continue to work because of that fear of loss of purpose and that fear of loss of social networks. So pension fund managers and Ontario Teachers Pension Plan and others have taken this real strong interest in this research and trying to understand how do they help set people up for purposeful living post-retirement. So I'll wrap up here with a few slides. This is, again, a further challenge to you guys, and I hope you'll pick it up. Again, probably something I don't need to convey here, but I think it's important that people understand that ageism is the single most socially accepted form of discrimination, period. We have many, many forms of discrimination, particularly if you live at the intersectionality of people who are already marginalized due to race or ethnicity, people who are already marginalized due to being LGBTQ2S. Whatever this intersection space, those people are even further marginalized and discriminated in society. We know that ageism, and I want to take a moment here to focus on the fact that ageism is not just something that society does. It is not just a state of society. Ageism is also a state of how we can see ourselves. And when we live in an ageist society, we tend to internalize a negative stereotype of aging, and that can actually have a significant impact on our lifespan. In fact, people who tend to internalize those negative stereotypes live about 7.5 years fewer, uh, uh, shorter lives than people who don't do that. And this comes back to, again, the fact that how we see ourselves actually drives our biology. So people who have or rate higher negative stereotypes of themselves in their aging trajectory are more likely to have poor mitochondrial function, are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease, are more likely even to have a stroke. And so these are not just kind of how I see my social existence. It also becomes a state of our physical existence. Um, Ageism in healthcare is even more problematic. And I talked about this earlier on, that my concern with the fact that we don't have great health standards for people 80 and older. And the literature tells us this means that when you're an older adult, particularly over the age of 80, and you show up at a hospital anywhere in the world, particularly here in Canada and specifically here in Ontario, you are much more likely to get poor health follow-up. And we know this even for people who have had strokes. Stroke, post-care stroke management in someone who is 75 and older is often considerably suboptimal compared to younger individuals, meaning they're less likely to get rehabilitation. They're less likely to get post-stroke care, such as regular blood pressure monitoring. They're less likely to be told to start an exercise program or to do those things that are proactive for preventing a second stroke or preventing the occurrence of dementia following a stroke, where there's a very high risk of developing dementia. So we have really, it is incumbent upon all of us to really think about how do we start setting ourselves up as a healthcare system for people in this age group. So 80% of Canadians who live over the age of 65 have at least one chronic health condition. Dementia costs our country $10.4 billion annually, and it's only rising. But our healthcare system was built for acute illness and not complex aging. And so prevention here, and what we're talking about, whether it's super aging research as I wrap up, or we're talking about just aging well in this country, prevention isn't just smart medicine. I argue that it's a civic and fiscal imperative. And in fact, how we set up our cities, how we design to keep ourselves active, how we think about ensuring that we do all that we can to eliminate the pandemic of social isolation in this country is really a responsibility that's full for society, not just for older adults. And we have the evidence sitting in front of us, whether it's from the research we're doing in super aging or the research from dementia. We have the evidence in front of us that says, the course is not always determined, right? We have this ability to act on aging. And so by now you've probably already guessed that I don't actually think aging is a disease. I will argue with people who say that. If aging is a disease, then maturing is a disease. Going from walking to running, going from running to being able to balance, all of those developmental stages would also be a disease, because we are aging from the day that we are born. So aging is not a disease, but we've been taught by society to fear getting older. And I think this is particularly true for women, although it differs for women and men in terms of how these fears come into play. But we've been taught to kind of think about this as, and Sally Shevers, who's a gerontologist here in Canada, highlighted this in one of her programs. It's this catastrophe that's waiting to happen. So we turn 50 and we're all sitting there waiting for this catastrophe to hit us, as opposed to embracing it and feeling that we're still in control of what this outcome is for us. Aging is not a crisis. It's a continuum. It is rich with complexity, creativity, and care. And more importantly, we are a better society when we have a balance of both younger individuals and older individuals. And so then my call to action for groups like yours is to continue the good fight that you're doing. continue to work to destigmatize aging and to create a better society where we can all do so in a healthy way. One, that's going to keep me in business as a researcher because you're generating the folks that I get to study and understand. But most importantly, it is creating not a better society just for older adults, but a better society for everyone. I truly thank you for everything that you do. I follow what this group does and have always been so impressed. I truly thank you for everything that you do. And I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Well, thank you for everything you do and for having documented all of this. And it's tremendously helpful to all of us. And we're very interested to hear what people think about what role SSAO can play in this because you've challenged us well. And I think we're up for the challenge, that's for sure. So I'm going to start off with I think Helen had a question.
So
Um,
I'm going to take that question. I'm going to comment on one thing in the chat. So Judith, I see that you posted the Disrupting Dementia Symposium. I was also involved with that. So Western helped to co-host that with the Alzheimer's research group. So you've got your notes, but I can also provide some added information to this group about where that direction's going, if that's something you all are interested in. So thanks so much for raising
Absolutely.
that meeting.
Absolutely. Okay. Helen, you had a question.
Sh-
Just going to.
Whoops. I'll say the contrast for me today is quite startling. I was on a Zoom this morning with Ontario Health East uh, status report. Matt Anderson was doing most of the talking. A great deal of emphasis on development of long-term care. I would, I very traditional approach to measuring healthcare outcomes. Certainly a recognition that the population is aging. Uh, I, I guess, do you have any influence over Ontario Health and over, it seems to me that what you're talking about, which others of us who work as volunteers, concepts are familiar, though I give you full credit. You've explained things as clearly as, very clearly, and extremely well done. But do you have any influence at this point over the very traditional rigid thinking of Ontario Health?
Yeah.
And I guess ancillary ministries like social services.
Yeah, thank you for that question in the comment. I try, right? So by that I mean I look for every inroad I can get into, right? So whether those are spending time on Parliament Hill, whether that's working with family physician groups and trying to use them as an inroad into more of the ministry level conversations. I will say sometimes that door is opened and sometimes that door is closed. And if there are any contexts you all have that you feel like you have an open door to that makes sense for me to meet and have these dialogues, absolutely open to doing that. I agree with you. There's a couple of things that we notice in long-term care, and I'm sure you all are aware of this because I know how much work you do in that space. A couple of things that are challenging. One, that is, we are putting our money there versus into wellness. And then the second challenge is that we are seeing higher acuity levels in long-term care because people are entering long-term care at an older age, right? And so,
Yes.
and oftentimes when they're quite sick. So this means the outcomes then need to change, right? We cannot use the same outcomes we've always used because the acuity level and the needs of those individuals are quite different. So I agree completely with you. It has always been interesting to me while we've tried a lot on the politics and government side. And we have, many of you will know, because I know some of you have worked in this space. We have government relations officers at most universities. Western has one as well. So I work closely with them to try to get any open door that we can get to have these conversations. They've been good at trying to support that. I actually just had a graduate student from my lab who's about to be hired by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care as a policy analyst. So I've also tried from that route. Can I train people that go to work in these organizations and actually, then open up opportunities for voices? But I don't think I have to tell you all how difficult and challenging that is. So always open to any avenues you can. Whenever I get an open door, if I need help, your group will be the one that I reach out to and say, can I borrow a few folks to come sit down with me at this meeting and kind of advocate alongside me? So I agree with you. That's where it's needed. I agree with you. It's persistently stubborn and difficult to get into that space. But do know it's not lost on me the importance of that. And we just keep trying, again, sometimes successfully and other times not.
Yeah, could I ask? I'm in Kingston, and
Hmm.
my association is with Catherine Donnelly and Vince DePaul at the School of
Hmm.
Rehab in Kingston, who are working
Hmm.
on the Oasis project development.
Hmm.
And so you are familiar with them. I just
Hmm.
wanted to check. I assumed you would be, but they are certainly conveying many of the same messages through their research.
Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent work being done in that area and really fantastic job. So give that group lots of credit as
Yeah,
well. But
it just seems to me, with the strength of your work and your
mhm.
message and theirs, that there need, amongst a cohesion of profound academic work that's highly credible, could be a really powerful force here.
I think one of the things that I'd like and I'm going to put this on your plate as a group to think about, perhaps. It's what I meant by these talks are great opportunities to come together and build partnerships. One of the things that's been on my mind for a little bit now, and in part because I'm a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and we often have opportunities to have a national platform that does often have a government reach. Is to actually host a little bit. And we did this, I'm going to say maybe 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, coming out of COVID, we did a symposium on aging that was attached to the G7 priorities. There was a focus on that in long-term care. But I think it's time to revisit that dialogue. And I think at a national level to draw together some of the academic partners, Helen, that you just identified, along with advocacy organizations like yourself. And so part of what is on my agenda for the summer and fall is to at least outline a proposal for an RSC program on this topic that tends to get some of the attention of government at the time and see if we can get an appetite for bringing together groups like yours, other academics from around the country, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, the Institute on Aging, which also has a strong desire to see some shifting in the healthcare priorities, and just really have a dialogue around this "are we ready" kind of piece. I think post-COVID, a lot of these national dialogues got centered on long-term care, which they should have, but that eclipsed the more general issue around health and health standards and health care for older adults in the country. And it became all about just long-term care. That is essential and it is important. But the partner to that conversation is just the health of people still living in the community, right? And so I think your comments help to reinforce that I know that may not be the perfect path, but is a path to kind of shine a spotlight and bring some groups together. And the RSC can sometimes provide a good platform for that and at least draw the attention it's
Mhm.
needed at a national level. So I think maybe what I will do is continue that working between CIHR and RSC to get that on and then kind of reach back out to you guys to see if that's something that would
Yeah.
work for you.
It's
Yeah,
Just as a
interesting that
partnership.
you say it. It's interesting that you say it because SSAO over the past few months has put a lot of pressure on CIHR to change
Hmm.
direction in the kinds of research that are being done and to move
Hmm.
much more towards the
Perfect.
community models. Helen is one of the past chairs of a large NORC in Kingston.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
been trying to develop a NORC movement across Ontario, which, if it comes together, could be a very powerful force for
Yeah.
change because it'll be a political force essentially. And we've
Hmm.
started connecting them directly to speaking directly to government, which I think is really, really important. We've
And
got about five people
oh,
here who would like to
okay,
say
I
something, so I'm
just
gonna,
really quickly, Trish, just say
oh,
you
sorry,
always
hon.
no, you always record these sessions, do you
I
not?
do.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to forward this to a number of people. Uh,
Wonderful. That's
yeah,
great, Helen.
yeah, okay,
The more the merrier, as you know.
yeah.
Okay, Jennifer Brooks, you had a question and comment as well. Jennifer Brooks, are you
Okay,
there?
yes.
There she
What
is.
a fabulous presentation. I have one question. My husband and I are in our late 70s. We're active and engaged. Some of our friends are already experiencing being in a caregiver role for their partner, for either Parkinson's, dementia, whatever. And my question to you is, does the caregiver role provide a means of being productive? Or does it impair our ability to pursue the five pillars, reduce our resilience, and prevent us from becoming superagers? So I guess it's a kind of a double-barreled question, but I think it's going to be a common one amongst many of us.
Yeah, I can tell you what the literature says. So the other parts of my research do involve carers of people with Parkinson's disease and dementia. We actually have an active clinical trial that's starting in September called Care Fit, which is a specific physical activity and wellness program built for dementia care partners. So Judith, you may have heard a little bit about that at the Disrupting Dementia conference. So just looking at your comments. So because here's what the science tells us. There are both positive aspects of caring and there are
Mhm.
negative aspects of caring.
Yeah.
Some of the positive aspects of caring are drawing closer to the individual in different ways than you may have experienced before they had a neurodegenerative condition. But the physical toll and the health tolls are clear. And so one of the things that we know, dementia caregivers are at a six-fold increased risk of developing dementia compared to their peers just through the stress and the biological impact of that stress on caring, right?
Mhm.
So caring for the caregivers is as much an important kind of national imperative as caring for anyone else. And part of why so some colleagues of ours at Waterloo have also been operating in this space as well. So Laura Middleton's group. What we are doing is intentionally in our clinical trial going after the specific markers that affect brain health, because we know that dementia carers are at this higher rate of dementia and higher risk of stroke, and we're trying to reverse that by doing something during their caregiving journey and ensuring that we've laid the confidence, the self-efficacy, and the platform for continuing self-wellness after that caregiving journey is done. There's two risk areas, right? During the caregiving journey and in that a period immediately following the caregiving journey where the body is settling and
Mhm.
one's, mindset is settling back. That is an equally paralyzing space for self-care. So it's not as if the caregiving journey ends and people immediately start caring
Right.
for themselves. It can take years for that to happen. And so we're trying to disrupt that. And so part of our disrupting dementia strategy is to disrupt what could be the negative health outcomes for care partners, and think about what are the interventions, how do we design those specifically for the lifestyle, the busyness, the emotional and physiological stress of caring. So your answer is yes, it's a negative impact in general. The net is negative. And there are those of us, I think, particularly here in a Canadian model, where we're trying to disrupt that pathway for sure.
Thank you.
I was just saying that we may have you back to talk about that, Angela, because
Mhm.
I'm sure
Yeah,
you'll get a lot of people
happy to
very
do that.
interested.
This is a second huge passion area for me. We have
Yeah.
been working in the caregiving space for years now. And I should say what's interesting is a number of our super agers, and I'll talk about our Canadian cohort because I know their histories a little bit more. Roughly half of our super aging dementia cohort our super aging cohort were carers of people with dementia in some
Yeah.
form or another. And
Yeah.
so Jen, to your point, for me, it's that question of what allowed them to survive that in a way that they continued on this path. Where's the resilience marker, right? Where's the resilience special sauce that meant that they got through that journey with exceptional cognition, let alone fighting the declines that we would normally see. And so that actually is a little bit of a nuanced research approach that we're starting to think about again for this next calendar year is what makes those folks special. And the Care Fit program that I just described to you actually came from the super agers because they said, we're worried about our peers who don't have the same outcome that we do. We've
Yeah.
all been caring. What are we doing for them? Let's understand that brain. So that entire program, the genesis of that came from super agers who said this is a gap in the science. And we
Yeah.
went after it, and indeed it was. So happy to
Yeah.
come back and kind of talk about that.
Yeah. I'm going to come to Judith, Kate, and Mark. But first, Bruna is asking if we can be given the research references.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I'll probably do is, and I can pull together a few more of those. Again, I tend not to just slam them into my slides, so I can pull together a bit of a bibliography, so to speak, on this exceptional cognition research, not just ours, but that's done around the world. If you'll give me a couple of weeks to get that done, and then I can send it out to you,
Absolutely.
Trish, to
Yeah,
distribute out
we
to
can send
people.
it out. We can send it out in our
Yep.
mailings.
Happy to
Okay,
do that.
Judith, you had two questions. Judith Fisher,
And once we have the results from the disrupting dementia, we can send them to you, Trish.
that would
But
be
the
great.
one thing that I was with Dr. Michael Borey,
Mhm.
and one thing that he really he's a gerontologist here in London, and he one thing he wants to move forward on is how do we embed some of the dementia strategies early
Mhm.
upstream, and how do we embed those into the with Jane Philpott's work, the emerging primary care network. So I just wondered, Angela, what your thoughts are in that. And Michael was very clear with me that he was not thinking everybody, but
Mhm.
more the high risk
Mhm.
people who are at high risk because of their history.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So I work closely with Michael. We've worked together since I was a clinician before I was a researcher. So Michael and I go back to the mid 1990s, at least in terms of working collaboratively in this area. And what he's been talking about, along with some of our other gerontologists in the area, the Canadian Center for Activity and Aging, because we're all kind of partnering in this space of how do we get more of these initiatives upstream. And so, what Michael would shape as dementia prevention, I would shape as healthy aging, and we're really talking about the same strategies. I think we can do and Michael and I, share meals together, and we've talked about this. I think we can do better than just targeting select folks or those high risk folks. Although I agree that for a scalable intervention, we need to be targeting someone, right? We need to send a message to physicians that these are the folks at highest risk, and we want to put something in place for them. I think I would like us to be more ambitious and take this to a larger cultural perspective of how do we approach healthcare and aging. Really, everything we do in terms of lifestyle interventions from 40 and beyond is about preventing stroke, preventing heart attacks, promoting brain health. And so I tend to be one who takes a little bit more of a universal design approach, but that's probably because I have a rehabilitation background and not a biomedical science perspective background. So we tend to be more participatory and whole person approached. Part of what we've been doing is working with the medical schools. Goes back to Helen's question, trying to work with the medical schools to get this healthy aging concept entrenched into the curriculums and this more gerontology approach entrenched in the curriculums, and shifting how residents and medical students see aging because they still see it as a disease model. It is something to be fixed. There are symptoms to be addressed. as opposed to working with people in their 50s and 60s, saying, how do we set you up for wellness and a better life as you get there? They're fundamentally different approaches to medical care. And so we've started here at Schulich, even in cases of bringing some of our superagers into the medical classrooms to show physicians in training and nurses in training that aging can look differently. It can look like this, and you should be managing your patients to get to this outcome, not managing your patients to think about, well, when you develop dementia, then I'll put these strategies in place. So we are all really, at least in the London area, we're a very tight-knit group in this area, and we're all working, even though how we may be thinking about doing or the messaging may be different, we're really all kind of rowing in the same direction of thinking about these better outcomes. So Michael's work I support. We've played a role in that. He supports what we're doing. I view it as not a prescriptive approach to certain individuals, but actually changing the ecosystem and the culture of how we think about health. So just a slightly different perspective. And
Yeah.
then Judith, to your question, yes, I knew Janice and quite well. Was that your question? Who asked the question about
No,
Janice?
I
Was
thought
that a
that was
different one?
just to you.
Okay, perfect.
So my I mean my background's rehab, but my husband was a speech language pathologist,
Yes.
and my best friend was Dr. Janice Warleeper and
So I knew Janice very
Andy
well.
Leeper. My
Yeah.
second question was whether or not we could influence at the municipal level, since we are coming into a municipal election, and the intersection with municipal and
Yeah.
federal and provincial. Because I um, I get antsy, so like things take so long. Like we
Yeah.
do have a municipal election coming up.
Yeah, that's the problem. And older people and all of us can certainly get out there and talk to our municipal politicians and talk about some of the things that need to be in place municipally support this kind of thing. And we do, you'll be happy to know, Angela talked to Ontario Health. So I know Helen's frustrated if she's been at one of the regional meetings, but we just go straight to the top because we can't deal with all of the regions. So we'll see what we can get going on that and see if we can get a conversation going. Ontario Health at Home has been very good at starting to work with researchers. So
Yeah.
we're going to try and get the same thing going for Ontario Health.
Yeah. Just
Kate,
keep me in the
Kate,
loop, whatever I can do. And Judith, municipally, locally, just reach out to me. If there's something we can do to help support or initiate, just give me a shout.
yeah, absolutely. Kate and Mark still have questions. So Kate Chung.
Okay, I'll just sort of read off what I wrote in the chat. At 78, I co-founded the Accessible Housing Network, which is now a national organization. We're everywhere in Canada except Yukon at this point. We're working to change all the housing laws to make accessibility, adaptability, universal design mandatory. We are consulted by other organizations and government officials, and I'm still at it at 84. And could it be that being a fighter helps us to be super agers?
100% yes. That is a defining trait of superagers is they are fighters for every cause, from human rights in the 60s and 70s to the causes of today, right? And so lifelong, especially with both women and men in this group have had passions, right? And that's what I meant by showing up for life. They just didn't show up at this age. They've always had this kind of activist mindset. And so I think not just activism, but optimism, right? And they don't view the world through rose-colored glasses. They see all of its ugliness, but they've tried to change it. And so I would agree with you that that definitely sets folks up. Mark, I see your question. Do you want me to address that, or do you want to
Go
ask
ahead.
it?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, if you
Uh,
could please. It's been difficult for about the last 10 years. My
Yeah.
wife had a physical disability and ended up retiring from work at about the age of 40.
Mhm.
I've recently retired forcibly, some to some extent because of ageism.
Yes.
And we're now both here in Waterloo. And because my wife she had an accident, she fractured one of her vertebrae during the winter, and that's severely limiting what she can do physically. For myself, I can do a lot more, but I find, from experience, I'm now finding that I'm not alone in that I don't want to be doing a lot of activities without her.
Hmm.
And that's hampering me. And we were both very internal type people to start with. We had very few friendships, but they were very strong. We moved here to Waterloo to care for her parents, and that basically ended up cutting us off from a lot of our friends because of the distance. So I'm just finding it very difficult, and I understand it is supposed to be very difficult as you age to build new friendships, etc. Um, I, Trish knows that, for instance, I've started volunteering since I retired, and that's keeping me a little more active in the community. My wife is much more limited in that respect, but is I just want to know, like, what kind of things have you found will help seniors to be able to make those kind of new friendships? And I appreciate Anne Marie sent a suggestion, and I'm definitely going to look into that group Probus.
Yeah. So I'll highlight a few things, and I won't give you the full workshop, but I actually did a workshop for the Retired Women's Teachers of Ontario last week, 2 weeks ago, sometime recently. They were in London, and we did a full workshop on really considering your social networks and how do you grow those and how do they change post-retirement. So it was a bit of a deep dive into this. I will endorse Anne Marie's suggestion of Probus. And so I was giving a talk to Probus yesterday. I probably give 5 or 6 Probus talks a year to different groups. They are a very, like this group, largely in-person meeting, but it's an opportunity to both connect, engage, learn from others, and certainly, Probus is an example of types of groups that are built really to optimize social engagement, particularly, and I find, and this may be why Anne Marie suggested it, for people who have had to relocate to other areas in retirement where you've had some disruption to that built-in social circle. So I think clubs, volunteering, as you've described, is also really important. I will say there are a couple of studies, though, that have looked at maintaining social relationships even through Zoom and virtual calls, and that has a benefit as well. So even, staying connected to the friendships that you had previously, better than talking on the phone. There is that face-to-face component that seems to be important,
Mhm.
even if it's happening in a virtual context. Because one of the things that we can find is that if we withdraw from those close relationships because now movement puts distance in place, it can lower our self-efficacy and confidence to build new friendships. And so by at least keeping, if you like, that social muscle a little bit viable, and reminding yourself that you don't have to see yourself in this isolated way, you can see yourself as connected to others. It can help to be that scaffolding to other relationships, and science has shown that. I will say that people will often say to me, well, you can't be a super H'er and be an introvert. And I fully disagree. In fact, I am, shockingly, probably to what you see here, one of the world's strongest introverts. I am socially adept, but I am a very, very strong introvert, and test that way as well as identify with all of those characteristics. So, um,
Well,
in
yeah.
fact, what we would find is that introverts may have a better chance of becoming super agers because the relationships that you form are
Mm.
deeply connected, right? And it is that depth of connection, not the shallowness of connection, that seems to matter. So in a way, you could say that introvert style of friendships and relationships are actually set up well, for super, whereas others have lots of friendships but struggle to do that depth of connection. But I would encourage you, and maybe one way to think about this, and I see that you're in Waterloo. There are some programs through the RIA there at the University of Waterloo that might both, and so if you'll send me an email, I'll connect you with the people who are operating those. That are both engage physical activity as well as social activity. And so they're very similar to our Canadian Center for Activity and Aging here. And they have adapted programs for people with various physical abilities, and they're often small classes, Mark. So they're not like rooms of 20 or 30 people, but
Mhm.
smaller classes and programs that they've built. So if you'll, lots of my research collaborators are involved. We kind of cross each other's spaces and share that. So if you'll send me an email, I'll get you connected with those folks. It might be a good just starting space for both joining in the physical components as well as the social components for you guys.
That would be huge. Thank you. And we're both Waterloo alumni, actually, so that
Oh,
Perfect.
that
fantastic.
leads very
There you
well. So
go.
that's where we met.
Fantastic. Oh,
Oh,
I
there
love
you
that.
go. There you go. And by the way, Dr. John Lord, who's a co-founder of SSAO, is also in Waterloo, and he is working at John would hate me using this word, but tormenting local politicians to
He is.
get them going to get them
Well,
going on things. So I will try and connect you with John as well, Mark, because I know that you've been politically active as well. So
I one of my main volunteering is with the local age friendly committee. So
perfect.
that's where my interest has grown exponentially now recently.
Yeah. We keep giving.
I will say with Anne Marie, if that's where you are, I think Probus is a really good alignment with some of
Yeah.
the
Okay.
interests that you have.
Well,
Yeah.
since we're only newly seniors, I've coined the new phrase, we're junior seniors.
Which
I
So,
means
love
you have energy for years to come, which is great.
oh, I hope
And
so.
Wanda is wonderful. She's in Durham region, and she's leaning on our local politicians to start doing something about Norks and supporting Norks as well. And that was her comment in the box. So
I
Yeah.
love that.
forming and talking about to politicians about supporting
Yeah.
Norks is important as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll keep up that fight too. We've worked with the Norks in the past, and in fact, some of the work that we've done through the Rotman Pension Institute has been with the Norks in Toronto alongside some of the pension groups. So we've aligned on similar causes in the past, and just, it's so important that we think about not just where the naturally occurring communities exist as we retire to the focus of the Norks, but again, this idea of stepping back and advocating for universally designed communities. So Kate, to your point, that can
Exactly.
adapt with people as we get older. And in truth, a community that's designed for well aging is also designed for accessibility for younger people who may be living with a variety of
Right.
differences, whether those are sensory differences or physical differences. Or emotional differences. And so really, the advocacy, and Kate said it best, is universal design. Let's design communities that work for all. And that lower the stigma. I think when we have to build specific communities or build specific tracks for aging persons, or, we're just further stigmatizing it.
Yeah.
So building for all, I think, is important. And so, yes, if we go back to the beginning, I do not believe that aging is a disease. That is not my bias point here. But I do believe it is important that we reconceptualize and design for aging from birth, right? And so that we are literally building communities that have low stigma, as well as are optimizing opportunities for people to stay connected and physically active as we get older. And be again in a healthcare system, again, a real sense of my advocacy is a healthcare system that's designed to let us age within it, versus having to land there as an older person and then find out it's not set up very well for us. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for all this and everybody who's on here, and what you've said gives me a lot more hope now, actually, and more positivity. So thank
Oh,
you.
we're a community, definitely a community, Mark.
It's
Um,
hard to find them nowadays. That's the biggest problem I find.
right,
It's true.
right.
It's
Well,
true.
this is part of the reason why we formed the organization. We know there are a lot of us out there, and we need to get together and, sort of be a force for change, which we fortunately have started to be, which is great. So, but Angela,
Thank
thank
you
you.
again. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much.
Listen,
Yeah.
thank you so much for this. And my husband Harry is still on the call. Harry, she's explained why we do what we do because we were involved in the civil rights movements and the war movement, anti-war movement in the 60s. So
Right.
I would say don't
I guess
stop.
it's
Just don't
stuck.
stop. Do not stop. Like the number of 80 and 90-year-olds I have that would describe themselves as suffragettes and still fighting for the rights,
There we
right? So
go.
don't ever let
Absolutely.
that go. So, and I truly mean when I say I appreciate everything that this group does, and it was my absolute honor and privilege to be here today. And I said this to Tricia a year ago or so when you first asked me to do this. Just, keep me involved. If there's anything I can ever do to be of service, please don't
Absolutely.
hesitate to ask. So,
Absolutely.
okay.
Well, we appreciate you greatly, and you're definitely one of our tribes, so we will definitely keep you involved in the advocacy that we do as well. So thank you
All
so
right. Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. So have a great afternoon, and look at that.
Thanks.
I think we're 1 minute over. That's not bad, Angela. Okay. All